The envelope was already open when I walked into the kitchen. My name is Claire, I'm 38 years old, and I remember thinking, in that very first second, that something about the way my father was standing, shoulders slightly forward, coffee mug held in both hands like a shield, told me everything before a single word left his mouth. I'd seen that posture before. At my mother's funeral. At the bank, when he'd asked me to co-sign something and then quietly never mentioned it again. Gerald Harmon stood the way men stand when they've already made a decision and are now simply waiting for the inconvenience of telling you. The letter on the table had my grandfather's lawyer's return address on it. Lawrence Pruitt, attorney at law, Harwick Falls, Ohio. Sit down, Claire, my father said. I didn't sit. I picked up the envelope instead. The paper inside was crisp and formal, the kind of document that has been photocopied 100 times but somehow always feels final. I read the relevant line twice before the meaning landed. The estate of Walter James Harmon, including the primary residence at 14 Caldwell Road, the adjacent parcel of approximately 3.4 acres, and all financial holdings therein, shall pass in their entirety to Nathan Gerald Harmon. Nate. My brother. All of it. I set the letter down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have gone slightly numb. There's an explanation, my father said. There always was. I'd spent the better part of my adult life in Harwick Falls, which is the kind of Ohio town that appears charming from the highway, old brick storefronts, a river walk, a few Victorian houses with wraparound porches that real estate listings describe as character-rich. My grandfather's house on Caldwell Road was one of them. 3 stories, a carriage house out back that he'd converted into a woodworking studio, and a garden I'd helped design when I was 26, my first real commission, done for free because it was Grandpa Walter and I would have done anything for him. He used to stand in that garden every morning in his robe, holding his tea, looking at the roses as if they were telling him something. He'd been gone 14 months. The will, apparently, had been quietly amended 16 months before his death. My father was still talking. Something about Nate's financial situation, about the property being better suited to a family home, about Grandpa's wishes being complicated, about things I hadn't understood. His voice moved through the kitchen like weather, present, then past, without quite landing anywhere. I looked at the letter again. 2 years earlier, Grandpa Walter had sat across from me at this same kitchen table and told me, very clearly, that the house was going to be split between Nate and me. He'd said it plainly, without sentiment, the way he said everything. 50-50. I've spoken to Larry Pruitt. It's in writing. He'd even smiled, that particular smile he reserved for moments when he felt he'd handled something correctly. I'd thanked him. I'd meant it. Somewhere between that conversation and his death, the will had changed. When did it change? I asked. My father looked at his coffee. There were some discussions, he said. Toward the end. Toward the end, when Grandpa Walter had been on 2 different medications for his heart and hadn't always remembered what day it was. I picked up my keys from the counter. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. We'll talk about this later, I said. I walked out into the gray November morning and sat in my car in the driveway for 4 minutes without starting the engine. The garden, my garden, was visible from the driveway, bare-branched and brown at the edges, the way gardens go in late autumn when they're waiting for someone to tend them. I didn't cry. I just sat there, looking at the roses I'd planted, and felt something shift inside me so quietly it was almost like nothing at all. I want to say I knew immediately that something was wrong, not just unfair, but deliberately engineered. But I didn't know that yet. I thought it was grief doing strange things to an old man's intentions. I told myself families make decisions in the dark of illness that they wouldn't make in daylight. I was generous with the explanation. I was too generous, and I would spend months regretting that particular kind of generosity. I've been a landscape architect for 11 years. I design outdoor spaces, commercial, residential, the occasional municipal project, and what that work has taught me, more than any formal training did, is how to read a landscape for what's happening underground. The visible surface is almost never the whole story. A tree that looks healthy from 30 feet away can have root rot eating through it. Ground that looks level can be channeling water in ways that will eventually crack the foundation. I thought about that a lot, in the weeks after I read the letter. My office was on the second floor of a converted factory building on Clement Street, overlooking the river. I went there every morning the way I always had, made my coffee, laid out my drawings, took calls. I was in the middle of a public park redesign for the city of Medina, significant project, good money, something I'd worked hard to win. I went through all the motions of my regular life. I answered emails. I returned calls. I went to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Donna called on the third day. Donna Marsh had been my closest friend since our late 20s, when we'd worked briefly in the same architectural firm before I went independent and she shifted into interior design. She was sharp and funny and knew Harwick Falls the way people know a town they grew up in and never entirely left, through a web of connections and old stories that ran deeper than any newcomer could easily navigate. She knew my family. She'd been at my mother's funeral 4 years ago. She'd been the one who brought food to my grandfather's house during those final weeks. I heard, she said, when I picked up. Your dad mentioned it to Paula, and Paula told me. Paula was Donna's neighbor. In Harwick Falls, this was how information traveled, sideways, through peripheral connections, arriving slightly altered and already warm to room temperature. How much did he tell Paula? I asked. Just that the estate went to Nate. That you were upset. Upset. The word sat wrong. I'm not upset, I said. I'm trying to understand what happened. There was a brief pause on Donna's end. You know how these things go, she said, and her voice had the soft, careful quality of someone choosing words deliberately. Your grandfather was sick. People make changes. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. I remember holding the phone away from my ear for a second and looking at it, the way you look at something when the thing that just came out of it doesn't quite match what you expected. I know, I said. I'm just looking into it. Of course, she said. Let me know if you need anything. We talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular, and when I hung up I sat for a while with the quiet feeling that the conversation had been slightly off, not in any way I could name, just a half step to the left of how Donna usually talked to me. She was usually the one pushing me to be angrier. She was usually the one who told me I was too forgiving. I filed it away. That same week, I drove out to the Caldwell Road house for the first time since the funeral. Nate was there, my brother, 44, heavier than he'd been 2 years ago, with the slightly soft quality of a man who had stopped making an effort some time ago. He worked in commercial insurance, sold policies, made decent money. He'd also had 2 bad years recently, a divorce that cost him significantly, debts I only knew about in outline, a general financial untidiness that he covered with the particular brand of breezy confidence that handsome men in mid-sized towns learn early and deploy often. He let me in without any awkwardness, which itself was awkward. Just wanted to look around, I said. Of course, he said. It's a lot to take in. He meant the house. But the phrase landed differently. I walked through the rooms. Grandpa Walter's presence was still everywhere, his reading chair, his books, his particular smell of cedar and old paper. The woodworking studio out back was locked. I stood in the garden for a few minutes. Someone had already started clearing out the beds I'd built, pulling up the lavender I'd planted along the south fence. What are you going to do with it? I asked when I came back inside. Probably renovate, Nate said. Eventually sell. Market's good right now. He said it with the mild tone of someone discussing a property investment. My grandfather had lived in that house for 41 years. I thanked Nate for letting me look around. I drove back to town. I stopped at a red light on Clement Street and noticed that my jaw had been clenched for 20 minutes. That's when I should have asked the question directly. Was the amendment to the will made while Grandpa was still fully competent? I didn't ask it. Not because I couldn't, because I wasn't ready for what asking would mean. There's a particular kind of silence you maintain when you know the answer will cost you everything. I chose that silence. I called it patience. It wasn't. Lawrence Pruitt's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Market Street, above a dry cleaning business that had been there as long as I could remember. The receptionist, a young woman with a careful smile, told me that Mr. Pruitt could see me the following Thursday. I said I'd wait for a cancellation. She called me the next day. A slot had opened. Pruitt was 70, precise, and gave the impression of a man who had spent so long handling other people's complicated situations that he'd achieved a permanent state of diplomatic neutrality. He had the will on his desk when I came in. He also had a copy of the amendment. The amendment was executed in March of last year, he told me. 14 months before your grandfather's death. Was he, I chose the word carefully. Was he fully himself when he signed it? Pruitt looked at me over his glasses. He was present. He answered my questions. I'm required to make a standard competency assessment, and I did so. What were the questions? A pause. I'm not at liberty to reproduce the full exchange. Can you tell me who was in the room? Another pause. Longer this time. Your father was present, at your grandfather's request. I let that settle. Standard practice? I asked. Not unusual, Pruitt said, when a family member assists with transportation. I looked at the amendment again. The language was clean, specific, and final. It did not read like the language of a man changing his mind independently. It read like language that had been prepared in advance and arrived in that room already finished. I asked Pruitt one more question. Had there been any prior discussion of changing the will before that appointment? He straightened a paper on his desk. I'm not able to speak to conversations outside this office, he said. I thanked him and left. On the sidewalk outside, I stood in the cold and felt, for the first time, the specific temperature of certainty. Not anger, something quieter and harder. I'd spent the last 3 weeks telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Standing outside Pruitt's office in February with my breath making small clouds in the air, I stopped telling myself that. I called Donna that evening. I think my father orchestrated the will change, I said. There was a pause. Longer than I expected. Claire, she said. That's a serious thing to say. I know it is. Do you have anything, are you sure you're not just processing? I said. Grieving? Making connections that aren't there? I didn't say that. But she had said something like it. And the careful, cushioning quality of her voice, the way she kept landing on words like maybe and probably and we don't really know, had taken on a texture that I recognized from my conversation with Pruitt. The texture of a person who already knows something and is deciding how much of it to give you. Have you talked to Nate recently? I asked. Not really, she said. I ran into him at the hardware store last week. I hadn't known she'd been to the hardware store. I hadn't known she and Nate ran into each other. These were small things, meaningless, individually. People run into people in small towns. That's the entire mechanism of a small town. But I wrote it down that night. I'd started keeping notes. I understood then, though I wouldn't have used this language at the time, that the thing I'd always called loyalty was really a kind of trust I'd extended without conditions. I'd never asked Donna what she knew and didn't know about my family because it hadn't occurred to me to ask. I trusted her the way you trust the ground, not because you've tested it, but because it's always held you. The most dangerous trust is the kind you've never had cause to question. 2 days later, I called my Uncle Pete, my father's younger brother, who lived in Columbus and had always maintained a careful distance from Gerald's particular style of family management. Pete picked up on the second ring. When I told him why I was calling, he went quiet for a moment. I wondered when you'd get around to this, he said. You knew? I didn't know. I suspected. There's a difference, or at least, I told myself there was. He paused. Your grandfather called me in January of last year, Claire. About 2 months before the amendment was signed. He said he'd been having some conversations with your father about the estate and he wanted my opinion on something. On what? On whether it was fair to restructure the inheritance based on who needed it more versus who'd earned it more. Another pause. He didn't use those words. But that was the shape of it. And? I told him I thought fairness and need weren't the same thing. He agreed with me. He said he'd think about it. Pete's voice shifted slightly. He sounded tired, Claire. And I know this is hard to hear, I think your father had been working on him for longer than any of us understood. I was standing in my kitchen, and the room had gone very still. Why didn't you call me? I said. A long pause. Because I told myself it was between you and your father. Because I thought Walter would hold his ground. Because I didn't want to be the person who started a war in the family over something that might never happen. He stopped. I'm sorry, he said. That was wrong. I found a probate attorney in Cleveland, Dr. Miriam Voss, a woman who had handled contested estates for 22 years and who, when I laid out the basic facts over the phone, said with quiet precision, what you're describing sounds like it may meet the threshold for undue influence. Let's look at what you have. What I had, initially, was not much. The amended will. My uncle's account of the phone call. My own memory of what Grandpa Walter had told me at the kitchen table. The timing of the amendment, 2 months after Pete's conversation with Walter, while Gerald was driving my grandfather to his appointments. Miriam told me that undue influence cases were difficult. They required evidence of 3 things: the testator's susceptibility, age, illness, dependence, the influencer's opportunity and access, and a result that was inconsistent with the testator's prior stated wishes. We had all 3, in outline. What we needed was documentation. I started methodically. I requested Grandpa Walter's medical records from that period, through proper legal channels. His cardiologist's notes from February and March of last year showed that he had been started on a new medication in January, a drug with a known side effect profile that included, in elderly patients, cognitive susceptibility and increased deference to authority figures. The notes were careful and clinical. But the language was there, if you knew what you were reading. I called 3 people who had seen my grandfather regularly in those final 2 years, his neighbor Margaret, who had taken him grocery shopping every other Tuesday, his woodworking group friend Harold, and the woman who came to clean the house on Fridays. All 3 said roughly the same thing, in their own words. Grandpa Walter had become, in his last year, more agreeable. More likely to defer. Less likely to push back. Margaret said he'd told her, around the time of the amendment, that he'd done what needed to be done for the family, and when she'd asked what he meant, he'd seemed not quite sure. I also found something I hadn't expected. In a box of paperwork that Nate had left on the Caldwell Road porch for me to pick up, a conciliatory gesture, he'd texted, so that I could have Grandpa's personal documents, I found a draft letter. Handwritten. My grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable. Dated 6 weeks after the amendment was signed. The letter was addressed to Lawrence Pruitt. It began, Larry, I've been thinking about the changes we made in March. I want to talk about whether it's possible to revisit. It ended there. 3 lines. Unfinished. The paper had been folded and then unfolded multiple times. He'd tried to change it back. He hadn't finished the letter. He had never sent it. I sat at my kitchen table with that unfinished letter for a very long time. The November light was fading outside and the house was quiet, and I thought about an old man starting a letter 3 times, or maybe more than 3 times, and never being able to finish it. Whether from illness, from pressure, from a kind of exhaustion that sits in the chest of people who are very old and very tired and have begun to understand that certain fights cost more than they have left. I photographed the letter. I put it in a protective sleeve. Then I thought about Donna. Looking back at that moment, I understand something now that I couldn't see clearly then. I had spent months gathering evidence about my father and none about my friend. I had extended the same blind trust to Donna that I'd extended to my family, which meant I was building a case with a missing wall. You can't understand a deception completely until you understand all of its participants. And I had been, deliberately or not, leaving one door closed. I went back through 3 years of small memories. Moments when Donna had, subtly, discouraged me from pushing on family matters. The phone calls after my mother's death, when Donna had repeatedly suggested that my conflict with Gerald was grief-speaking. The times she'd casually mentioned information about Nate, his divorce proceedings, his financial situation, that I'd attributed to small-town network but now reconsidered. The conversation in the days after the letter, when she'd been so careful to soften every edge. I drove to her studio on a Thursday afternoon without calling first. She was at her drafting table when I walked in, and the surprise on her face was real, a half-second of something that was not guilt, exactly, but a cousin of it. She recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly. "I need to ask you something directly," I said. "Okay." Her voice was level. "Did you know about the will before I found out?" She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her drafting table. That look, the slight downward shift of her eyes, was the only answer I needed, but I waited anyway. "Nate mentioned it," she said finally. "A few months before. He was venting to me about his financial situation and it came up. And you didn't tell me." "He asked me not to." She looked up. "Claire, I was in an impossible position. I didn't want to destroy the peace," I said. "Cause a scene. Start a war." I could hear the echo of her own words, and Pete's words, and my own words, all in a row. A whole family of people who knew and said nothing and called it kindness. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it, I believed she meant it. That was the hardest part. She was sorry and she had done it anyway, and those two things coexisted without canceling each other out. I left without saying much more. There wasn't much more to say. The filing was in early March. Miriam Voss submitted the formal challenge to the amended will on the grounds of undue influence, supported by the medical records, the neighbor testimonies, the unfinished letter, and Pete's account. The estate was placed in provisional hold pending probate review. My father called me the morning after the filing. His voice was different, no longer the careful, measured tone of a man managing a difficult conversation. There was an edge in it that I recognized from my childhood. It was the sound Gerald Harmon made when the situation had slipped outside of his control. "This is a mistake," he said. "I don't think it is," I said. "You're going to tear this family apart over money." "I'm going to establish what Grandpa Walter actually wanted," I said. "Those aren't the same thing. He wanted what was best for this family. He wanted to leave me half his estate," I said. "He told me that himself. He told Pete. And then you sat with him in a lawyer's office when he was on a new medication he'd been on for 6 weeks, and something changed." Silence. The particular silence of a man who has been named precisely. "He made his own choices," my father said. The unfinished letter to Pruitt suggests he wasn't sure about that. More silence. "Claire." His voice shifted again, softer now, the tone he used when he decided that force wasn't working and another approach was required. "Your brother needs this more than you do. You have your career. Your income. Nate has been struggling." "Nate is 44 years old," I said. "His financial situation is not Grandpa Walter's responsibility. It's not my grandfather's legacy to fix." I heard him exhale. Then, "You were always the difficult one." I'd heard that line before. It had landed differently at different points in my life. At 38, it simply washed over me without snagging. "Goodbye, Dad," I said. The probate review took 4 months. It was procedurally dry and emotionally exhausting in equal measure: depositions, document review, a mediation session that went nowhere when Nate refused to engage in any meaningful compromise. The turning point came from a source I had not anticipated. Pruitt himself came forward. He submitted a statement to the probate court saying that at the time of the amendment, he had had concerns about the conditions under which the appointment had been arranged, that my father had scheduled it on Gerald's behalf without informing Pruitt in advance that there had been prior discussions about restructuring the will, and that he had been present in the room in a way that Pruitt had felt unable to object to without creating a confrontation. He had made a professional error in proceeding. He wanted to correct the record. I read that statement 3 times. Larry Pruitt, 70 years old, 40 years in this town, the kind of reputation that only accrues to people who have always done things correctly, had felt unable to object to my father in a room. Had let it proceed anyway. And had carried that for 14 months before submitting a statement to a probate court. That detail, a 70-year-old lawyer who had been managed in a room by a 71-year-old man, told me more about how my father operated than anything else in the entire case. I had always known, at some peripheral level, that my father was a man who arranged things. Who came to situations already prepared, who had conversations in advance that shaped what looked like spontaneous decisions. I'd grown up in that current without ever fully recognizing it for what it was. Children don't analyze the water they swim in. They only feel whether it's warm or cold. Mine had been cold for a long time, I just called it normal. That was the universal thing I discovered inside all of this, not just my story, but something true about any long deception. The people most successfully manipulated are the ones who loved the manipulator first. Not because love makes you stupid, but because love establishes trust before suspicion has any reason to exist. My grandfather trusted his son. I trusted my father at a foundational level even when I disagreed with him. Donna trusted that loyalty to a friend and loyalty to silence could coexist. We were all held in place by something we'd never thought to question. The probate court ruled in June. The amended will was invalidated on the grounds of undue influence. The estate reverted to the prior instrument, the one Pruitt had drawn up years earlier, the one with my grandfather's original intentions. 50-50. Nate signed the required documents without speaking to me. My father did not come to the final hearing. I stood in the parking lot outside the courthouse in the June heat, the ruling document in my hand, and felt, not triumph. Nothing as simple as that. More like the specific relief of a structural problem finally being correctly diagnosed. The ground had been uneven for years. Now it was level. That was all. The carriage house on Caldwell Road is mine now. Nate took the main house as his half, a choice that surprised me until I remembered that the main house was what he'd wanted all along, both because of what it would sell for and because of some old score he'd been keeping since childhood. Some competition over who Grandpa Walter loved more that I had never entirely understood and had mostly ignored. He sold it within the year. I heard it went to a young family from Columbus. I hope they're happy there. I've been renovating the carriage house for 6 months. It's small, a ground floor, a sleeping loft, a garden that is technically separate from the main house property and had been deeded to me specifically because I designed it. My lawyer flagged that detail during the property division. The garden I'd built at 26, my first real commission, was mine in the document's original form. My grandfather had been precise about that. He'd always been precise. I think about that sometimes, about the small, deliberate ways he had tried to make things right even when he couldn't hold the larger structure together. The garden. The unfinished letter. The phone call to Pete. A man who had been maneuvered into something he didn't want and had spent his remaining months leaving breadcrumbs he hoped someone would eventually find. I found them. 14 months too late to tell him that I had, and that they mattered. Donna and I have not recovered the friendship entirely. That's not a dramatic statement, there's no anger left in it. We meet occasionally for coffee. The warmth is real but the architecture of it has changed. There's a slight formality now, a careful distance that neither of us mentions and both of us maintain. She made a choice when she knew something important and said nothing. She's never fully accounted for it, and I've never fully required her to. We've each accepted a version of the friendship that costs less than the whole truth would have. That's its own kind of loss. My father called once in September, about 4 months after the ruling. He said he wanted to talk. I said I was open to talking. We met at the kitchen table, his kitchen table, not Grandpa's, and he said several things that were almost apologies and none of them quite arrived. He talked about doing what he thought was best. About Nate's situation. About how I'd always been the one who could take care of herself. That last line, meant as a compliment, may have been the most honest thing he said. I thanked him for meeting with me. I drove home. I don't hate him. I'm not sure what I feel, exactly, something more nuanced and less resolved than hatred. I understand him, which is different from forgiving him, and possibly more uncomfortable. A man who believed that rearranging the outcome was the same as making it right. Who told himself the story so many times it became, for him, the truth. I've stopped trying to rewrite that part. In March, I finished the park redesign in Medina. The city was pleased. My client offered me a second project, a riverfront development, larger and more complex, the kind of work I'd wanted to take on for years. I said yes without hesitation. I plant things for a living. I understand that what appears above the ground is the product of decisions made underground, years earlier, in the dark. I understand that root systems are slow and largely invisible and form the entire basis of what eventually becomes visible. What I know now that I didn't know at 37 is that this is true of families too. Grandpa Walter's roses are coming back in the carriage house garden. I found 3 surviving canes under the debris last autumn, cut them back, mulched them properly. They broke dormancy in April, small red buds, cautious and exact. I stood in the garden in the early morning with my coffee, the way he used to. It was enough. What makes this story worth examining beyond the legal outcome is what it reveals about the infrastructure of family loyalty, how it can be weaponized by the very people who built it. Gerald Harmon did not simply change a will. He understood, with precise social intelligence, exactly which relationships in the family formed the weight-bearing walls. He'd observed, over decades, that Claire was self-sufficient and Nate was not. He translated that observation not into investment in Nate's growth but into a financial redistribution he could justify to himself as fairness. The sophistication of this was that he likely believed his own framing. He had convinced himself that need was a legitimate measure of inheritance, which conveniently aligned with what he wanted to do anyway. This is self-deception operating at its most functional, when the story you tell yourself serves your purposes so completely that it no longer feels like a story. What the embedded layers of this narrative trace, and what becomes clearest only in retrospect, is how the manipulation operated through legitimate seeming channels. Gerald did not forge a document or lie to a judge. He arranged appointments. He was present in rooms. He had conversations in advance that shaped the conditions under which decisions were made. This is the sophisticated form of control, not coercion but architecture. He built the situation so that the outcome he wanted would appear to emerge naturally. Walter didn't feel forced. He felt listened to, supported, understood. And then he signed something that he would spend the next months trying to quietly undo. The Donna thread reveals something the main conflict doesn't fully expose on its own, that complicity in a family manipulation doesn't require active participation. It requires only silence. Donna knew months before Claire. She made a choice, understandable in its human logic, wrong in its consequences, to prioritize the absence of conflict over the presence of truth. This is what unresolved loyalty does. It doesn't create betrayers. It creates bystanders who call themselves neutral while one party loses information they needed. The friendship's current state, warm, careful, slightly formal, is the honest reckoning with that reality. Not punishment. Just the natural shape of a trust that has been structurally altered. The unfinished letter is the story's moral center. An old man, medicated and tired, writing to his lawyer 3 lines at a time, trying to correct something that had been done in his name. The letter was never sent. But it was real. It was physical evidence that Walter James Harmon had known, at some level, that something had gone wrong. He had not had the energy to fix it. He had left the evidence anyway. That act, incomplete, failing, ultimately successful 14 months after his death, is the most human moment in the story. Most of us will never write that letter. Most of us leave less. Claire won the legal case. What she could not win back was time, the 2 years of family silence, the 14 months with her grandfather already gone, the version of herself that might have asked harder questions earlier and gotten harder answers while Walter was still present to speak for himself. That gap between what justice produces and what it cannot restore is where this story actually ends, regardless of what any court ruled. What stays with me most, thinking about Claire's story, is the unfinished letter. 3 lines. Folded and unfolded. We tend to imagine that people who are deceived by their families don't know it on some level. But I think that's too comfortable a reading. Walter knew. He started the correction and couldn't complete it. That's not ignorance, that's exhaustion. And the question the story quietly leaves open is one I think about for myself, and maybe you do too. When we have something we need to say, something that would cost us energy and conflict and the comfort of a fragile peace, how many of us start the letter? How many of us finish it? Claire finished it for him. That's not a small thing.